The city of Lagos breathed in a rhythm all its own, a chaotic symphony of blaring horns, hawkers' cries, and the ever-present hum of generators. In this concrete jungle of 17 million souls, where dreams rose like skyscrapers and hopes crumbled like aging infrastructure, moved a man whose life's work was as peculiar as it was profound. Ifeanyi Nwachukwu stood at his usual spot by the bus rapid transit terminal in Oshodi, his eyes scanning the morning crowd with the practiced ease of someone who had spent 15 years reading the unspoken language of human sorrow. At 45, his face bore the gentle wear of time, with laugh lines around his eyes that contradicted the sadness he carried within. Dressed in simple but clean trousers and a slightly faded conductor's uniform, he blended into the urban landscape like just another piece of the city's moving mosaic. Ashodi to Yaba, Ashodi to Yaba, his voice rang out, clear and calm amid the morning chaos. But while other conductors focused solely on collecting fares, Ifeanyi collected something far more valuable: tears. His unusual vocation had begun exactly 15 years, 2 months, and 14 days ago, though he never marked the anniversary. The memory lived in him like a second heartbeat, constant and inescapable. He had been Dr. Ifeanyi Nwachukwu then, a respected pediatrician with a thriving practice in Ikja. He had a beautiful wife, Chinwe, whose laughter could light up a room, and a 3-year-old daughter, Nneka, whose curious eyes held the promise of generations. The tragedy had occurred on a Tuesday, the day that would forever divide his life into before and after. Nneka had been playing with a new educational toy while Chinwe prepared dinner. The small plastic piece that was supposed to teach shapes had become lodged in her tiny throat. By the time they reached the hospital where Ifeanyi worked, her lips had turned blue. The last thing he remembered was the single tear that escaped Chinwe's eye and fell onto Nneka's still face, a perfect, crystalline drop that contained an entire universe of shattered dreams. In the devastating months that followed, his marriage crumbled under the weight of shared grief. Chinwe moved back to her family in Enugu, and Ifeanyi quit his medical practice. The sight of children had become unbearable, the sterile smell of hospitals suffocating. He needed to disappear to become someone else entirely. That's how Dr. Ifeanyi Nwachukwu became simply Ifeanyi the bus conductor, and how his strange new purpose was born. "Every tear deserves a clean landing," he would murmur, offering his signature white handkerchief to crying passengers. The phrase had become his mantra, his reason for being. On this particular humid Monday morning, his bus, number 14B, was particularly crowded. Students in uniform clutching textbooks, market women with baskets of goods, office workers already looking weary at 7 a.m. Ifeanyi moved through the aisle with practiced grace, collecting fares while his eyes continuously scanned for that particular glassy sheen that preceded tears. He spotted her near the back, a young woman in a corporate dress, trying to discreetly wipe her eyes while staring at her phone. Ifeanyi approached gently. "Bad news?" he asked softly, extending his handkerchief. The woman, she couldn't have been more than 25, looked up, startled. My boyfriend just texted me. He's getting married to someone else." Ifeanyi nodded. Tier number 4217, he thought to himself. He had developed a system over the years, documenting each tier in a series of notebooks he kept in his small room. This one would be recorded as young woman, blue dress, heartbreak text, Oshodi route. He didn't just remember the tiers, he remembered the stories. There was the university student crying because she'd failed an exam her parents had sacrificed everything for. The construction worker weeping silently because his wife was having their first child and he couldn't afford the hospital bills. The elderly man who cried when he received a letter from a daughter who had emigrated to Canada 5 years earlier. His fellow conductors thought him eccentric. Ifeanyi and his tears again, they would chuckle. Passengers often reacted with suspicion at first. Tears were private things, not meant to be noticed by strangers, certainly not by bus conductors. But Ifani had developed a sensitivity to human sorrow that bordered on the supernatural. He could spot the precise moment when someone's composure began to crack, the slight tremor in the hands, the rapid blinking, the way the throat moved when swallowing emotion. As the bus navigated the choked arteries of Lagos, Ifani continued his work. He comforted a young mother whose child was running a fever, helping her rearrange her packages so she could hold the toddler more comfortably. He quietly paid the fare for an elderly woman who realized she'd forgotten her wallet. These small acts of kindness were as much a part of his ritual as the tear collection. His one-room apartment in a Face Me, I Face You compound in Mushin was a sanctuary of memories. The walls were bare except for a single photograph of Nneka, the last one taken before she died. Stacked neatly on crude wooden shelves were 38 identical notebooks, each filled with his elegant handwriting documenting every tear he had collected. Tear 1, Chinwe, our daughter's face, the hospital, was all the first notebook contained. The entry for today would be more detailed, as all the recent ones were. After his shift, Ifani sat at his small table, the notebook open before him. The evening rain had started, drumming a familiar rhythm on the corrugated iron roof. He wrote, Tier 4217, young woman approximately 25, corporate attire. Received text from boyfriend announcing his marriage to another. Tears of betrayal mixed with self-doubt. Offered handkerchief, accepted after hesitation. Reminded me that some pains are chosen for us, while others we choose through who we love. He closed the notebook and looked at Nneka's photograph. I'm still collecting my love, he whispered, one tear at a time. Little did he know that the next day would bring a passenger who would challenge everything he thought he knew about grief, healing, and the purpose of his unusual calling. A woman whose tears would eventually lead him back to his own. The rain had not ceased by morning. Lagos wore the downpour like a weary shroud, the usual vibrant chaos muted to a watercolor wash of grays and muted tones. Ifani stood under the slight overhang of the Oshodi terminal, the damp air carrying the familiar sense of wet asphalt, frying akara, and the underlying brine from the distant lagoon. Bus 14B groaned to a stop before him, its windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the torrent. Ifani boarded, his conductor's bag heavy with change. His heart heavier still with the accumulated sorrows of 15 years. The humid interior smelled of damp clothes and humanity. He went through the motions, calling out stops, making change, helping passengers with packages, all while his eyes continued their endless search. The morning passed in a blur of familiar faces and routine exchanges until the bus pulled up at the National Theater stop. She entered in a whisper of expensive perfume and rustling silk, a stark contrast to the bus's worn interior. A woman in her late 40s, dressed in a tailored navy blue dress that spoke of money and taste. Gold earrings glinted at her ears, and her leather handbag probably cost more than Ifani made in 6 months. But it was her eyes that caught his attention, dry, but with a depth of sorrow so profound that Ifani felt his breath catch. She took a seat near the middle, back straight, hands folded neatly in her lap. To anyone else she appeared composed, perhaps even aloof. But Ifani saw the tension in her shoulders, the slight tremble in her carefully manicured hands, the way her gaze remained fixed on some middle distance, unseeing. The bus moved on, lumbering through the flooded streets. Ifani continued his work, but his attention kept returning to the well-dressed woman. He sensed the storm raging within her, a tempest of emotion held back by sheer force of will. He had seen this before. The wealthy who believed tears were a luxury they couldn't afford, a sign of weakness in a world that demanded strength. At the next stop, a commotion broke out near the front. A market woman's basket had overturned, scattering dried fish across the wet floor. In the chaos of retrieving the goods, the well-dressed woman's phone slipped from her lap and clattered to the floor. Ifani moved to help, retrieving the device. As he handed it back, their fingers brushed, and in that brief contact he felt it, a wave of sorrow so potent it nearly brought him to his knees. Her eyes met his, and for a fleeting moment the carefully constructed walls came down, and he saw the raw, unvarnished pain within. "Thank you," she said, her voice cultured, educated, but with a tremor she couldn't quite conceal. The moment passed, the walls went back up, and she returned to studying the rain-streaked window. But Iphany knew. He had seen that particular shade of grief before, the kind that comes from losing a child. The bus continued its slow progress through the flooded streets. At the costing stop, the woman received a text message. Iphany watched as she read it, her face remaining perfectly composed even as her knuckles whitened around the phone. And then he saw it. The slightest sheen in her eyes, the rapid blinking, the telltale signs he had come to recognize so well. He moved through the crowded bus, his handkerchief already in hand. "Every tear deserves a clean landing," he said softly, extending the white cloth. She looked up, startled, then embarrassed. "I'm fine," she said, her voice tight as she produced her own silk handkerchief. But Iphany had already collected her tear in his memory. "You're not crying because of the text," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're crying because today is the anniversary." Her composure shattered. The perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the sudden pallor of her skin. "How could you possibly know that?" she breathed, her eyes wide with something between fear and wonder. Iphany simply smiled gently. "Your perfume can't hide the scent of sadness, madam." The bus arrived at her stop, the affluent neighborhood of Ikoyi. She rose on unsteady legs, pausing to look back at Iphany. "Who are you?" she asked, the question hanging in the air between them. "A collector of tears," he replied simply. That should have been the end of it. Another tear collected, another story filed away in his memory and later in his notebooks. But as fate would have it, their paths were destined to cross again. That evening, as Iphany was closing up the bus, he found her waiting at the terminal. The rain had eased to a drizzle, and she stood under a black umbrella, looking out of place amidst the bustling terminal. "I need to know how you knew," she said without preamble. "No one knows what today is, not even my husband." Iphany wiped his hands on a rag, considering. He rarely shared his story, but something about this woman, the depth of her grief, the way she carried it like a secret burden, moved him. "Come," he said, "there's a place nearby." He took her to Mama Nkechai's Buka, a small eatery tucked away in a side street, where the air was thick with the scent of pepper soup and the sound of high-life music from an old radio. Over bowls of steaming soup, he told her his story, the condensed version, leaving out the medical details, focusing only on the loss. When he finished, her eyes were dry but her hands trembled around her spoon. "I lost my daughter too," she whispered. "Amanda, 10 years ago today. Car accident on the 3rd mainland bridge." She was Ajora Nwasu, wife of a prominent businessman, mother to a daughter who would never grow up. She told him about the memorial services she couldn't attend, the grief counseling she refused, the way she had buried herself in charity work and social events, building a life that looked perfect from the outside but was hollow within. "I haven't cried since the funeral," she confessed. "I thought if I started I might never stop." Iphany listened, truly listened, in the way he had learned to do over the years. Not just to her words, but to the spaces between them, to the pain that lingered in every syllable. "Tears are not a weakness, madam," he said gently. "They are the proof that we loved, that we remember." She looked at him, really looked at him, seeing past the conductor's uniform to the man beneath. "You're not what you appear to be, are you?" Iphany smiled sadly. "None of us are." They parted ways as the night deepened, with a promise from Ajora to ride his bus again. As Iphany walked home through the damp streets, he felt something unfamiliar, a flicker of connection, the sense that his solitary mission might be about to change. Back in his small room, he opened his current notebook. The entry for Ajora Nwasu was longer than most. Ter 4218, Ajora Nwasu, approximately 48, wealthy. Lost daughter Amanda 10 years ago in accident. Has not cried since funeral. Carries grief like an expensive handbag, always with her, never setting it down. First passenger to see the man behind the conductor. Reminded me that money cannot buy immunity from sorrow. He closed the notebook, the rain his only companion. For the first time in 15 years, he felt the stirrings of something he had thought long dead, the possibility that his collection of tears might somehow lead to his own healing. The rains continued for 3 days, washing Lagos in shades of gray and silver. Ifeanyi went through his routines, the early morning preparations, the long hours on bus 14B, the quiet evenings with his notebooks, but something had shifted within him. The encounter with Ajora had stirred memories and emotions he had carefully buried beneath years of collected tears. On the 4th morning, as sunlight finally broke through the clouds, Ajora was waiting at his usual stop. She looked different, softer somehow, in a simple cotton dress instead of her usual expensive silks, her hair pulled back in a loose bun. "You were right," she said without preamble as she boarded the bus. "I need to cry." Ifeanyi simply nodded and took her fare. Throughout the journey to Yaba, he watched her from the corner of his eye. She sat by the window, watching the city wake up, the street sweepers beginning their work, the early morning vendors setting up their stalls, the school children in crisp uniforms. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, and Ifeanyi could see the battle raging within her, the need to release warring with 15 years of practiced control. At the Yaba terminus, as other passengers disembarked, Ajora remained seated. "I went to the support group," she said quietly. "The one you mentioned. I sat in the parking lot for an hour but couldn't bring myself to go in." Ifeanyi began cleaning the bus, wiping down seats with a damp cloth. "The first step is often the hardest," he said, "but you already took it by going there." She watched him work, this man who carried so much wisdom in such a humble occupation. "How do you do it?" she asked. "How do you carry everyone's pain and not collapse under the weight?" Ifeanyi paused his cleaning, considering. "I used to think I was honoring my daughter by collecting tears, but lately I've been wondering if I was just hiding from my own." The honesty of his admission hung between them. For 15 years, he had been the strong one, the observer, the collector. But Adeora's presence in his life was making him question everything. Over the next 2 weeks, a routine developed. Ajora would ride his bus several times a week, always at different times, always dressed more simply than before. Sometimes they would talk, sometimes they would ride in comfortable silence. She told him about Amanda, her love for painting, her terrible singing voice, the way she would arrange her stuffed animals by color. Ifeanyi, in turn, shared stories of Nneka, her first steps, her obsession with butterflies, the way she would fall asleep clutching a particular red blanket. One evening, as Ifeanyi was closing up the bus, Ajora's husband appeared. Chief Nwasu was a large man, impeccably dressed, with an air of authority that came from years of being obeyed. "My wife has been riding your bus," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "She talks about you, about your tear collection." Ifeanyi met his gaze steadily. "I mean your wife no harm, sir." "Then what do you want? Money? Influence? What's your angle?" Ifeanyi smiled sadly. "There is no angle, Chief, only shared grief." The chief's composure cracked slightly. "We don't need your help. We've managed our grief for 10 years. "Have you?" Ifeanyi asked gently. "Or have you just been managing to avoid it?" The truth of the question hung between them. Chief Nwasu looked away first, his shoulders slumping. "She won't talk to me," he confessed, the anger draining from his voice. "Not about Amanda. She's built this perfect life around our loss, and I'm not allowed to mention the hole in the center of it." "If you'd like," Ifeanyi said quietly, "you could ride with us tomorrow, both of you." The next morning, Chief Nwasu boarded bus 14B with his wife. He looked uncomfortable in the crowded vehicle, his expensive suit at odds with the worn seats and the mingled scents of its passengers. Ajiora looked surprised but pleased. The ride started in awkward silence, but as the bus made its way through Lagos's morning traffic, something shifted. A young mother boarded with twin Bobbies, and Chief Nwasu, to everyone's surprise, gave up his seat. An elderly man struggled with a heavy bag, and the chief helped him stow it safely. At the Yaba terminus, as the bus emptied, Chief Nwasu turned to Ifani. "I think I understand now," he said quietly. "It's not about the tears themselves, is it? It's about the humanity behind them." Ifani nodded. "Exactly, sir." That evening, the three of them went to Mama Nkechai's buka again. Over pepper soup and cold drinks, they talked, really talked, about Amanda for the first time in years. Chief Nwasu cried, great heaving sobs that shook his large frame, and Ajora held his hand, her own tears finally falling after a decade of resistance. Ifani watched them, his own eyes dry but his heart full. In helping them find their tears, he had given them back to each other. Later that night, back in his small room, Ifani made an entry in his notebook. Tears 4219 and 4220, Chief and Mrs. Nwasu, finally crying together for their daughter Amanda. 10 years of stored grief released in a small buka in Yaba. Reminded me that some tears are meant to be shared, that grief kept separate can destroy, but grief shared can heal. He closed the notebook and looked at Nneka's photograph. "I think I'm ready to cry for you, my love," he whispered to the empty room, "but I don't know how anymore." The next day brought the storm that would change everything. Tropical rains lashed Lagos, flooding streets and stranding commuters. Bus 14B was caught in the worst of it, stuck in knee-deep water near Costain. Panic spread through the bus as the water continued to rise. In the chaos, a young mother screamed. Her baby was burning with fever and they were trapped. Ifani took charge, organizing passengers to help push the bus to higher ground. As he worked, coordinating the effort, something broke within him. The careful control he had maintained for 15 years shattered. Standing in the pouring rain, soaked to the skin, surrounded by strangers working together, Ifani felt the first tear fall. Then another, and another. Great, heaving sobs that had been stored up for a decade and a half finally broke free. He cried for Nneka. He cried for Chinwe. He cried for all the tears he had collected but never shed. And as he cried, he realized he had no handkerchief for his own tears, the tear collector finally crying, with nothing to collect his own sorrow. Passengers stared, shocked by the transformation of their always composed conductor. But Ajiora, who had been on the bus that day, understood. She waded through the floodwater and simply stood beside him, her presence a silent support as he finally released the ocean of grief he had been carrying. When the storm passed and the bus was safe, something had changed in Ifani. The weight he had carried for so long felt lighter. The memories of Nneka remained, but the sharp edge of the pain had dulled. That night, he made the final entry in his current notebook. Tier 4221, my own. After 15 years, finally cried for Nneka. Discovered that in collecting others' tears, I was preserving my own. Learned that grief shared is grief halved, but tears unshed become poison in the soul. The collector has finally collected his own tear. He closed the notebook for the last time. The tear collection was complete. The morning after the storm, Lagos emerged washed clean, the air smelling of wet earth and renewal. Ifani stood before his small mirror, preparing for work, and saw a different man staring back. The lines of sorrow around his eyes seemed softer, the set of his shoulders less burdened. For the first time in 15 years, he had cried himself to sleep, and instead of feeling broken, he felt cleansed. When he arrived at the Ashodi terminal, his fellow conductors noticed the change immediately. "Ifani, you look lighter," one of them remarked. "Did you win lottery?" Ifani simply smiled, something like that. Bus 14B felt different that day. The usual weight he carried seemed to have lifted, and he moved through the aisle with a new energy. He still noticed the sorrows around him, the tired mother trying to quiet her crying baby, the young man staring blankly at a rejection letter, the elderly woman counting her meager change. But now he saw their struggles through different eyes. Adjora boarded at her usual stop, but this time she wasn't alone. Chief Nwasu stood beside her, dressed not in his usual expensive suit but in simple trousers and a casual shirt. They held hands, something Ifani had never seen them do before. "We have a proposition for you," Adjora said, her eyes bright with excitement. "We want to start a proper grief counseling center, and we want you to help us run it." Ifani stared at them, the bus fare forgotten in his hand. "Me, I'm just a bus conductor." "You're much more than that," Chief Nwasu said firmly. "You have a gift, Ifani. You understand grief in a way no therapist ever could." The idea took root in Ifani's mind throughout the day. As he collected fares and helped passengers, he found himself thinking about all the people he had encountered over the years, the thousands of tears, the countless stories of loss and resilience. Maybe there was a way to use his unusual gift to help people more directly. That evening they met at the Nwosis Ikoyi home, a beautiful house that had felt empty despite its luxurious furnishings until recently. Over dinner, they planned the center. "We'll call it the Healing Place," Adjora said excitedly, "and we'll have you lead the support groups, your experience, your understanding." "If I may," Ifani interrupted gently, "I think we should call it the Tear Collection Center, because that's what we'll be doing, not eliminating grief but collecting it, honoring it, helping people carry it." The name resonated with all of them. Plans took shape late into the night. The location, a quiet building in Yaba that the Nwosis would purchase. The programs, support groups, individual counseling, art therapy, and most importantly, the philosophy. That grief was not something to be gotten over but something to be carried, that tears were not a sign of weakness but of love. In the following weeks, a transformation occurred that touched many lives. Ifani continued to work on Bus 14B, but now he carried brochures for the center, gently offering them to passengers who seemed burdened by sorrow. The Nwosis used their influence and resources to spread the word, and soon people began coming to the center, not just the wealthy from Ikoyi and Victoria Island, but market women from Mushin, students from Yaba, office workers from Marina. Ifani discovered he had a natural talent for facilitating the support groups. He didn't use psychological jargon or complicated theories. He simply created a space where people felt safe to share their stories, to cry without shame, to remember without fear. One rainy afternoon, about 3 months after the center opened, a familiar figure appeared at the door during one of Ifani's support groups. Chinwe, his ex-wife, stood there hesitantly, her hair grayer than he remembered, her eyes holding the same sorrow he had carried for so long. "I heard about this place," she said softly. "I heard you were here." The group fell silent as Ifani rose to meet her. 15 years of separation hung between them, filled with all the words they had never said, all the tears they had never shared. "I'm glad you came," Ifani said, his voice thick with emotion. That evening, after the group had dispersed, they sat in the center's small garden, the rain having softened to a gentle drizzle. They talked for hours, about Nneka, about their marriage, about the years apart. They cried together, finally sharing the grief that had driven them apart. "It wasn't your fault," Chinwe said, taking his hand. "The accident, it wasn't anyone's fault." "I know that now," Ifani replied. "But it took me 15 years and thousands of tears to believe it." Chinwe decided to stay in Lagos and help with the center. Her background in nursing combined with Ifani's unique understanding of grief made them an effective team. Slowly, carefully, they began to rebuild their relationship, not as husband and wife, but as friends bound by shared loss and a new purpose. The center flourished, becoming a sanctuary for the grieving throughout Lagos. Ifani still worked on bus 14B a few days a week. He found he couldn't completely leave behind the place where his healing had begun. But now, instead of just collecting tears, he was guiding people toward healing. One sunny afternoon, about a year after the center opened, Ifani stood before a new support group. Among the faces was a young conductor from another route who had recently lost his mother. "I don't know how to cry," the young man confessed. "I feel like if I start, I'll never stop." Ifani smiled gently. "I used to think that too, but now I know that tears are like the rain. They water the soul so new growth can happen." After the session, as Ifani was closing up the center, he paused before the tear collection wall, a beautiful mosaic where visitors could place a small, symbolic tear-shaped stone to represent their grief. Thousands of stones covered the wall, each one a story, each one a life touched by loss but moving toward healing. He added his own stone, a simple white one for Nneka. Then he added another, a blue one for all the tears he had collected over the years. Finally, he placed a green one for the new growth that comes after grief. That night in his small room, the same room but feeling different now, filled with light and purpose, he didn't write in a notebook. Instead, he wrote a letter to Nneka, telling her about the center, about all the people they were helping, about how her brief life had ultimately brought healing to so many. "I finally understand, my love," he wrote. "I wasn't just collecting tears, I was collecting stories, I was collecting healing, I was collecting hope, and in helping others find their way through grief, I finally found my own way back to life." He sealed the letter and placed it in a small box where he kept Nneka's photograph and the red blanket she had loved so much. Then he blew out the lamp and went asleep, not with the heavy sorrow that had been his companion for 15 years, but with a peaceful heart, knowing that while some tears would always fall, they no longer had to drown him. The tear collector had finally found peace, not in forgetting his daughter, but in honoring her memory through helping others. And in the quiet of the Lagos night, as the city slept and dreams took flight, Ifani Nwachukwu slept too, a man who had collected thousands of tears but had finally learned to let his own flow freely, washing him clean, making him new.